Thomas Adams had always loved the ranch life. His family had owned the sprawling acres of land for generations, stretching as far as the eye could see. But now the once thriving ranch was crumbling around him. The barn's wood was weathered, and the crops seemed to wilt no matter how much care he put into them. Thomas had always dreamed of passing the ranch on to his children, to watch them run across the same fields he had as a boy. But life had other plans. He'd spent years trying, with little success, to start a family with his wife, Mary. But after multiple visits to doctors, it became clear Thomas was infertile. He couldn't have children. The thought of his family's legacy dying with him broke his heart, and his wife, while supportive, knew the weight it had on him. The ranch, their home, was their life, and with no heir to take it over, Thomas felt like it would all be for nothing. His dreams felt shattered, as if the very land beneath his feet was slipping away. Years passed, and with no way to expand the family, the situation grew worse. The bills piled up. The once thriving farm was barely making ends meet. His debt was like a shadow that loomed over every waking moment. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about survival. One evening, Thomas sat at the dinner table staring at the bills in front of him. He knew the ranch was worth something, but it wasn't enough. There had been talk in town about an unusual solution. People had whispered about an auction, a way to sell a person's labor for a set period, a way to make some quick cash in dire times. Thomas didn't want to admit it, but at that moment it seemed like his only option. "I don't know how much longer we can hold on," Thomas said softly to Mary, looking up from the pile of bills. Her face was tired, her eyes red from worry, but she didn't say anything in response. She knew. The next few days were a blur. Word spread quickly through town about Thomas's decision. Some were sympathetic, others cruel. But no one could deny that the idea of selling himself at auction was both unusual and desperate. It wasn't common for men to put themselves up for such a thing, especially not a rancher like Thomas. Yet as the auction day drew nearer, it was clear that there would be a crowd. People were curious. They wanted to see what would happen. The day of the auction arrived, and Thomas felt a strange mix of shame and resolve. As he walked toward the small gathering by the town square, the eyes of the community followed him, some with pity, others with judgment. He had never felt so exposed in his life. It wasn't just that he was selling his labor. He was giving up his dignity. But at least it would provide a temporary solution, he told himself. A dusty wooden platform was set up with the auctioneer standing at the ready. People gathered around, chatting among themselves as they looked over the rancher who stood nervously before them. Thomas couldn't help but notice the strange looks. Some of the men shook their heads while the women whispered. The auctioneer, an old man with a thick, gravelly voice, stood at the front of the stage. He adjusted his hat, cleared his throat, and began the event. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer called out, his voice booming across the square. "Today we have an unusual offering. Thomas Adams, rancher and farmer. A strong, capable man looking for work. What am I bid for a day's labor from this fine gentleman?" The auctioneer's words echoed in the air, but no one spoke. A heavy silence filled the square as everyone waited for someone to make the first bid. Thomas shifted uncomfortably on his feet. He had always been a proud man, someone who worked with his hands, someone who could handle almost anything that came his way. But standing there now, being auctioned off like a piece of livestock, felt wrong. It didn't feel like him at all. Minutes passed, and still no one spoke up. Thomas's heart sank. The money he needed to save his farm wasn't going to come from this. He could feel the weight of the moment, the humiliation of standing there for all to see with no one willing to take him on. His thoughts wandered back to the ranch. His dream of passing it on to his children seemed like a distant memory. What would become of the land after him? What would become of his legacy? Then, just as the auctioneer was about to call the auction off, a voice broke through the crowd. "I'll give $5. The crowd turned toward the source of the bid. 7 women, all standing together, looked back at the crowd. The women were not from the town's regular social circle. They had lost husbands, each to different circumstances, some to illness, some to accidents. All of them were widows, and none of them had remarried. They had a quiet reputation in town, independent, resilient, but not much else was known about them. They rarely spoke up, kept to themselves mostly, and certainly weren't the kind of women anyone would expect to be bidding on a man. The auctioneer blinked, taken aback. $5 was nothing. The entire town knew it. But the women stood firm, all their eyes on Thomas, not in pity, but in something else. Something Thomas couldn't quite understand. It wasn't mockery, but there was a certainty in their stance. $5, one of the women repeated, her voice steady and sure. That's our offer. We'll buy him for $5. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. $5? The amount was laughable. It wasn't enough to even buy a sack of grain, but it was an offer. The auctioneer looked between the women and Thomas, then back to the crowd, unsure what to do. There was an awkward pause as everyone waited for someone else to speak up. But no one did. Finally, the auctioneer shrugged, his voice sounding almost defeated. Sold, he said. And with that, Thomas found himself sold. Not to a farm or a business, but to 7 women who saw something in him that no one else could see. For $5, Thomas Adams, the struggling rancher, had just been bought by 7 widows. The crowd dispersed, some laughing, some shaking their heads. But as Thomas stood there, still stunned, the widows approached him. They didn't speak at first, but their gaze was unyielding, and Thomas couldn't help but feel that this strange moment, this auction, might just be the beginning of something he never could have expected. The dust from the auction settled, and Thomas stood there, still unsure of what had just happened. For $5 he had been bought. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring and whispering among themselves, Thomas glanced at the 7 women who had just purchased him. They stood in a quiet circle, their faces calm but their eyes fixed on him. They weren't laughing. They weren't mocking him. There was something else in their gaze, something he couldn't quite place, but it wasn't pity. It was something deeper. The women didn't say a word as they walked toward him. Each of them moved with a quiet confidence that made Thomas feel like he was the one who should be following them, not the other way around. He had always been used to leading, but here he was, a man who had once been a rancher with dreams of a family, now at the mercy of 7 strangers. One of the women, a tall woman with dark hair and striking features, stepped forward. Her name was Evelyn. She was the oldest of the group, perhaps in her late 40s, but she carried herself with a grace that made her look younger. Evelyn was known in the town for being a woman of few words. She didn't need to speak much, for people listened when she did. There was an unspoken authority about her that commanded respect. She had lost her husband, a kind and hard-working man, 5 years ago. Since then, she had been running her small farm on her own, learning to make tough decisions and manage her land. "I'm Evelyn," she said softly, offering Thomas her hand. "And these are my sisters-in-arms, as they like to call themselves." She gestured to the other women standing behind her. Thomas shook her hand hesitantly, unsure of what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before. His mind was racing with questions. What did they want with him? Why had they bought him? Was this some sort of joke? But Evelyn's steady gaze calmed him, and for the first time that day he felt like he could breathe. "We'll need to talk," Evelyn continued. "We've made an arrangement, but there's a lot for you to understand. Follow us." Thomas didn't know what else to do but follow. As they walked together through the dusty streets, people stared at them, whispering and pointing. It was clear that the town was watching, and gossip would spread like wildfire. But Thomas didn't care anymore. He had no choice. These women had made an offer, and now they were taking him to wherever it was they intended to go. They led him out of the town and down a narrow road that eventually opened up to a small, well-kept farmhouse. It wasn't as big as Thomas's ranch had once been, but it had a charm of its own. The fields surrounding it were neatly tended, and there were chickens clucking around while a couple of cows grazed lazily in the distance. It was peaceful, a far cry from the chaos of the auction. Evelyn led him into the house, where a large wooden table stood in the middle of a modest but cozy kitchen. The others took their seats around the table, and Thomas hesitated before sitting down. He could feel their eyes on him as they settled into their spots. "We didn't just buy you for your labor," Evelyn began, her voice firm but kind. "We didn't come here to take advantage of you. We've all been through a lot. We've all lost people we loved. Some of us have tried to run our farms on our own, and others have had their hands full with other challenges. But we're strong, and we need help." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn raised a hand, stopping him. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You probably think this is all some sort of joke, or that we're here to humiliate you. But that's not the case. Each of us has something to offer. We've all lost our husbands, but that doesn't mean we're weak. We've learned how to survive, But there's only so much one person can do. That's where you come in. The other women nodded in agreement, and one of them, a younger woman named Clara, spoke up. We know you've struggled, Thomas. Everyone in town knows. But we've watched you. We've seen how hard you work, how you never give up. That's why we decided to buy you. We don't need you for anything other than your strength. We need someone who can help us work the land, someone who can share the load, and someone who will not give up when things get tough. Thomas felt a weight lift off his shoulders as he listened to Clara's words. It was different from anything he had expected. They weren't asking for him to be their husband, or for anything more than his willingness to work with them. There was something powerful about their words, something that made him realize that this wasn't about him being sold. It was about the women coming together, offering each other support and strength. Evelyn continued, We all have our own skills and experience. We all bring something to the table, but we need someone who can help us with the physical work, with the tasks that require more hands. You're not alone here, Thomas. We're in this together. The other women spoke briefly, each one sharing their own story. Sarah, a widow with 2 young children, had lost her husband in a farming accident. Her farm was small, but she worked tirelessly every day to keep things running. Margaret, another widow, had grown up on a ranch and was skilled in animal husbandry. She had been managing her husband's cattle for years, but needed help with the heavier work. And there was Lily, the youngest of the group, who had only recently lost her husband to illness. She was a skilled cook and gardener, but lacked the muscle to handle the harder tasks. We've all learned how to adapt, Evelyn said, but we can't do it alone. And that's why we need you, Thomas. Thomas sat quietly for a moment, processing what they were saying. He had been expecting something entirely different. He had thought they might want him for something else, something he wasn't ready for. But instead, they were offering him an opportunity, a chance to work alongside them, to build something together. For the first time in a long time, Thomas felt a spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story after all. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. All right, Thomas said finally, looking around the table at the 7 women who had bought him. I'll help. I don't know what this will look like, but I'll do my best. Evelyn gave him a small smile, and the other women nodded. That's all we ask, she said. And so Thomas began his new life, one that was nothing like he had expected. It wasn't just about farming. It wasn't just about working the land. It was about building something from the ground up, side by side with women who knew what it meant to fight for what they believed in, and to stand together when the world had knocked them down. Little did Thomas know, this unusual beginning would set the stage for a new kind of family, a family formed not out of blood, but out of shared strength, purpose, and resilience. And as the days passed, Thomas would come to realize that he was not just working for them, but with them. And that made all the difference. As the days passed, Thomas quickly realized that his life had taken an unexpected turn. No longer was he just a struggling rancher trying to keep his family's land afloat. He was part of something bigger, something that defied the traditional roles and expectations he had known his whole life. The 7 women who had bought him were not just there to take advantage of his labor. They had a plan. They were building something together, a life that was theirs to shape, a future that wasn't defined by the circumstances they had been dealt. The first few days were filled with hard work. Thomas was no stranger to the grueling physical demands of ranching, but it felt different now. The women didn't just supervise the work. They were right there alongside him, each contributing in their own way. Evelyn, the quiet leader of the group, had a way of managing the day's tasks with precision. She knew when to push harder and when to step back. Margaret, the animal expert, seemed to know every cow, every goat, and every horse by name. She could calm the wildest beast with just a few soothing words and a gentle touch. Clara, the youngest of the group, took charge of the garden, growing vegetables and herbs that would feed them throughout the year. Lily, who had lost her husband to illness, became a source of comfort, cooking meals and helping where she could, often working late into the night to make sure everyone had what they needed. The work was tough, but there was a sense of camaraderie that made it bearable. Each day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they would sit around the large wooden table in the farmhouse, eating simple but hearty meals. There was no awkwardness between them anymore. Thomas had settled into a rhythm, and the women had become more than just his employers. They were his partners, They shared stories, laughed together, and occasionally even cried. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just about survival, it was about rebuilding, about creating something new. One evening, as the stars twinkled above them, Evelyn called the group together. Thomas could sense that she had something important to say. The others had gathered in the living room, and the atmosphere was calm but expectant. "We've been working hard these last few weeks," Evelyn began, her voice steady but serious. "And we've made good progress. The crops are growing well, the animals are thriving, and we're getting the land back into shape. But it's not enough." Thomas looked at her puzzled. They had already made great strides, and he had assumed that things were going well. But Evelyn's face told a different story. "We need more than just this land to survive," she continued. "We need to make sure we have a future, something that will keep us all going even when times are hard. And that's why I've been thinking about something." The women nodded, their eyes fixed on Evelyn. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity. He had no idea what was coming, but he could tell it was important. "I've been thinking that we need to turn this place into something more than just a farm," Evelyn said, her gaze sweeping across the group. "We need to make it a business, a sustainable one. We've got the skills, the land, and the resources. We could grow more crops, raise more animals, and even sell what we produce. But we can't just be farmers. We need to be entrepreneurs." The idea hung in the air for a moment. Thomas had never considered farming as a business venture. He had always seen it as a way of life, a way to survive, not necessarily something that could generate profit. But as he looked around at the women, he saw something in their eyes, a determination to succeed, a willingness to take risks, and a desire to create a future that was entirely in their hands. "I know it sounds like a big leap," Evelyn continued, breaking the silence, "but we've been surviving on our own for too long. We need to do more than just get by. We need to thrive." Margaret spoke up, her voice full of conviction. "I've been thinking about the animals. We've got the expertise, and there's a demand for quality livestock around here. We could sell cattle, pigs, and goats to the nearby towns. People are always looking for fresh, healthy animals for their own farms. We could even start breeding them ourselves." Clara chimed in, her enthusiasm evident. "And the crops. We've got an excellent piece of land here, and with the right care, we could grow all kinds of produce, not just for ourselves but to sell in the market. There's a lot of money to be made in farming if we do it right." Lily, who had been quiet up until that point, nodded thoughtfully. "And we've got the skills to make this work. Between all of us, we can handle the cooking, the preserving, the marketing, and the selling. We just need to be organized." Thomas listened, feeling a spark of excitement in his chest. This wasn't just about working the land anymore. This was about taking control of their own futures, about making the farm a place that could support not just them, but a whole community. He could see it now. A thriving farm, bustling with activity and supporting not just the widows but others in need as well. "But we'll need help," Evelyn added, breaking into Thomas's thoughts. "This won't happen overnight, and we'll have to learn a lot as we go. But if we pull together, we can make this work." The more Thomas listened, the more he realized how much he had underestimated the women. They weren't just strong workers. They were visionaries thinking beyond survival and into the future. They were building something that could last, something that would provide for them and eventually for others. He had always thought of himself as the one with the plans, the one who knew how to make things work. But now he was learning that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships could create the most powerful change. As the meeting continued, the women divided the tasks. Margaret would take charge of the livestock and begin organizing the breeding program. Clara would oversee the crops and start planning out what would be grown for the coming season. Lily would take on the responsibility of preserving food and creating products like jams, jellies, and pickles to sell. And Thomas was going to help with whatever needed doing. But he would also take the lead on managing the finances and keeping track of the business side of things. "We'll start small," Evelyn said, "but we need to think big. This farm could be the foundation of something much larger. We can build a legacy here." Thomas felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had come here feeling lost, unsure of his place in the world. But now, surrounded by these strong, capable women, he saw a new possibility for himself. He wasn't just a man who had been bought at an auction. He was part of a team, a family, working toward something greater than any of them could accomplish alone. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving, about building a future together. And Thomas knew, deep down, that this was exactly the kind of challenge he had been looking for, one that would push him to grow and discover his own strength, just as the women had already done. The plan was set. The work would be hard and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but one thing was certain. They were in this together, and together they would make it work. As the weeks went by, the farm began to change in ways Thomas had never imagined. When he first arrived, the place was tired, run down, forgotten, and on the brink of collapse. Now it was transforming into something new, something full of life and possibility. The farm wasn't just a place where the 7 women worked anymore. It was a hub of activity, full of energy and hope. Every day brought new challenges, but also new rewards. And Thomas found himself more and more involved, not just in the hard labor, but in the growing dreams of the women. It was clear from the very first week that things weren't going to be easy. The work was long and demanding. The weather was unpredictable, and the land didn't always give back what they put into it. There were moments when they felt like giving up, when the weight of their responsibilities seemed too heavy. But they had made a pact to work together to push through and to make this farm succeed. At first, Thomas struggled to adapt to the pace. He had been used to running his own ranch before, where he had made all the decisions. Now he was part of a team. It wasn't just about getting the job done, it was about collaborating, about listening and learning from the women around him. Every evening when they gathered around the dinner table, they didn't just share a meal. They shared ideas, solutions, and plans for the future. Evelyn, ever the quiet leader, had a way of guiding the group with her calm wisdom. She knew when to step in and when to step back. She was a master at knowing what needed to be done and how to get it done efficiently. Her approach to the farm was both practical and visionary. She saw the big picture, and her ability to bring everyone together made her the glue that held everything together. Margaret, with her deep knowledge of livestock, was the heart of the animal operation. She had always known how to care for animals, but now she was teaching the others, including Thomas, how to raise and breed the livestock properly. She taught him how to tell which cows were ready to breed, how to manage the pasture, and how to deal with the unexpected challenges that came with raising animals. Her expertise was invaluable, and Thomas found himself respecting her not just for her knowledge, but for her unshakable determination. Clara, the youngest widow, was full of energy and ideas. She had grown up in the city and had no experience with farming, but that didn't stop her. She dove into the work with a passion and quickly became the one to organize the garden. It wasn't just about growing food, it was about growing the right food for the market. She learned about crop rotation, about the importance of soil health, and about which plants would thrive in their particular environment. Over time, the garden flourished, providing an abundance of vegetables and herbs that they could sell in town. Lily, the cook, brought something else to the table, literally. She was the one who kept morale high with her delicious meals, made from the very ingredients they grew themselves. Her skills in the kitchen were a constant reminder of how important it was to use everything they had. Nothing went to waste. Leftover vegetables became soups or pickles, and eggs from the chickens were turned into pies or sold. Her creativity in the kitchen helped them not only sustain themselves, but also turned their food into a commodity they could sell to the townsfolk. As for Thomas, at first he had just been the worker, the man who did what needed to be done. But slowly he found himself taking on more and more responsibility. He had always been good with numbers, and now he found himself managing the finances of the farm, keeping track of expenses and helping to plan for the future. He set up a system to track their income from the animals, the crops, and the food they sold. His keen eye for detail helped the women keep everything running smoothly. But it wasn't just about numbers for him. Thomas began to understand what it meant to be a part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just working for a paycheck anymore. He was working for a cause, a shared dream of creating something lasting. One of the most significant changes for Thomas was how he began to see the women around him. In the beginning, he had viewed them as just the ones who had bought him at the auction. They were strangers to him, and he didn't know how to fit into their lives. But as they worked side by side, day after day, he began to see them as more than just his co-workers. They were resilient, capable, and fiercely determined. They weren't just surviving, they were building something meaningful. Thomas was inspired by their strength and their ability to find joy in the smallest things. The transformation wasn't just physical, It wasn't just about the land becoming more fertile or the animals becoming healthier. It was about the way Thomas saw himself and his place in the world. Before, he had been a man broken by his inability to father children, weighed down by the failure of his ranch, and haunted by the fear that his legacy would disappear with him. But now he was part of something that could last, a family of sorts built on hard work, shared purpose, and mutual respect. As the farm began to thrive, so did Thomas. He started to feel a sense of pride in what they were creating. The crops were growing better than ever, and the livestock was thriving. They had even started to sell some of their produce in the nearby town, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were impressed by the quality of the products they were selling, and word began to spread. More and more people came to the farm, eager to buy fresh produce, homemade jams, and even some of the animals Margaret had raised. They had gone from a struggling, barely surviving farm to a flourishing business. But it wasn't just the physical transformation of the land that gave Thomas hope. It was the way the women had brought him into their circle. They didn't treat him like an outsider or a hired hand. They treated him like family. There were no divisions based on gender or status. Everyone was equal here. Everyone had a role to play. And for the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. It wasn't about his past, his inability to father children, or his failed ranch. It was about what they were building together. A new kind of family. One based on strength, hard work, and shared dreams. One evening, as the sun set and the group gathered to eat another simple, hearty meal, Thomas looked around at the women. They were talking and laughing, sharing stories about their lives before the farm. He realized how far they had come in such a short time. What had started as a desperate situation, him being sold at auction for $5, had turned into something incredible. They were building a life together. They had created something that no one could take away from them. Thomas smiled to himself. The ranch had always been his dream, but it was now clear to him that the farm wasn't just his, it was theirs. They had all contributed to its success, and together, they had built something that would last. It wasn't the kind of legacy he had once imagined, but it was a legacy nonetheless. A legacy built on love, respect, and the strength to rise above the challenges life had thrown their way. And as he sat at the table with the women, he knew that the best was yet to come. The transformation was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt like he had found his place in the world. The farm had changed, and so had Thomas. What had once been a place of struggle and uncertainty had now become a symbol of hope, hard work, and the power of community. The 7 women who had bought him for $5 at the auction had not only given him a second chance, they had given him a new purpose. And as the weeks turned into months, Thomas found himself not just working alongside them, but growing alongside them as well. It was early in the spring when they received their first big order. A local market in the nearby town had heard about the quality of their produce and their livestock, and they wanted to place a bulk order for fresh vegetables and meats. For the first time, the women looked at each other with excitement and a bit of nervousness. This was the moment they had been working toward, the moment when their hard work could really pay off. Evelyn was the first to speak up. "This is it. This is our chance to show what we can do," she said, looking at each of the women. "But we need to be prepared. We've got to make sure everything is perfect." Thomas, who had been helping manage the finances, was already on top of it. He had organized the order, keeping track of the inventory and making sure they had enough of everything. Margaret and Clara took charge of preparing the livestock and produce, while Lily worked with the other women to prepare packaged goods like jams, jellies, and pickles. It was a team effort, and as they worked late into the night, there was a buzz of energy in the air. This was the culmination of everything they had been building, a chance to take their farm from a small local operation to something bigger. The morning of the delivery, the farm was alive with activity. The air was filled with the sounds of clucking chickens, the mooing of cows, and the occasional laughter of the women as they moved quickly but efficiently. Thomas watched as Evelyn checked the delivery lists one more time, her brow furrowed in concentration. He could see how much this meant to her. She had always been the one to guide them, the steady force that kept everyone focused, and now, she was about to see all of their hard work come to fruition. As the delivery truck arrived to pick up their goods, the women stood together, watching as their products were loaded into the back. There was a feeling of pride among them, pride in the work they had done and in the journey they had taken to get here. They had come a long way from the days when Thomas had been sold at auction for $5. Now they were a force to be reckoned with, a group of women who had turned their shared vision into a thriving business. The days that followed were busy, but filled with anticipation. The orders kept coming in, and the farm began to feel more like a real business. People from the town started to visit more often, not just to buy fresh produce, but also to see what the women were doing. The women had earned the respect of the community, and Thomas had earned his place among them. One evening, after another long day of work, the women gathered in the farmhouse for dinner. The mood was lighter now. There were fewer worries, fewer moments of doubt. The farm was doing well, and they could finally see the results of their hard work. As they sat around the table, passing dishes and chatting, Thomas looked around at the women. He realized how much they had become a family to him. It wasn't just about the business or the farm anymore. It was about the bonds they had formed, the friendships that had grown out of necessity and had turned into something far more meaningful. "I never thought it would turn out like this," Thomas said, breaking the silence. The others looked at him, and he could see that they all felt the same way. Evelyn smiled. "None of us did," she said softly. "But that's the beauty of it. We never gave up. We didn't let the setbacks stop us. We kept going, and now here we are." "I don't know where I'd be without you all," Thomas continued, his voice filled with gratitude. "You gave me a chance when I didn't even know I needed one." Margaret reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've always had a place with us, Thomas. You're not just part of the farm, you're part of our family." Thomas looked around at the women. It wasn't just the work they had done together that had changed him. It was the way they had accepted him, supported him, and helped him see his own worth again. They had shown him that family didn't always mean blood. Sometimes, family was about the people you chose to stand by and the shared dreams you built together. In the months that followed, the farm continued to grow. They expanded their operations, adding more crops, more animals, and even taking on a few more employees from the local town. The business was thriving, and the women's dreams were becoming a reality. But it wasn't just about the farm anymore. It was about the legacy they were creating, a legacy built on hard work, resilience, and the bonds they had formed. Thomas found that he no longer felt the emptiness that had once consumed him. He had always thought his worth was tied to what he could produce, to whether or not he could have children and carry on his family's name. But now he understood that true worth wasn't about meeting other people's expectations. It was about creating something meaningful with the people you cared about. And it was about leaving behind something that could outlast you. The farm had become a symbol of all that they had accomplished together. It wasn't just about the land or the animals. It was about the community they had built, the lives they had touched, and the family they had created from the ashes of their individual struggles. As the seasons changed and the farm continued to flourish, Thomas often found himself standing in the fields looking out over the land. He thought back to the day when he had been sold at auction, when he had felt like he had nothing left. It seemed like a lifetime ago. He had come so far since then, and he knew that with the women by his side, the future was bright. The farm was no longer just a place where they worked. It was a home, a family, a legacy. And Thomas knew that no matter what challenges came their way, they would face them together, just as they had from the very beginning. Together, they had built something that would last, something that would stand the test of time. And that, in the end, was more than he could have ever dreamed of.